All right, welcome everyone to our first, actually our first official Strong Youth Program video recording. I'm happy to be here. My name is Matt Seeley. I'm the host today, and I'm the co-founder of the Strong Youth Project here at Brigham Young University. And I'm glad to have Alyssa Higley with me today. She's a student research assistant working with the Strong Youth Program. And we're also very grateful to have Dr. Jake Sorensen with us today. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Exercise Sciences here at Brigham Young University. And we've asked Jake to join us this morning because he is an expert in the area of resistance training. He has some practical experience in the area as he's worked as a strength and conditioning coach in the past. He's now a scientist here at BYU in our Department of Exercise Sciences. I'll let him tell you more about what he does at the current time, but I do know he's currently studying different molecular mechanisms for skeletal muscle hypertrophy. So welcome both Alyssa and Jake. Jake, can I ask you first to get us going here? Will you tell us just a little bit about yourself and where you come from? Tell us about your educational background as well as what you've done in the field.
Yeah, sure. And yes, thanks. First off, thanks for having me here. This is a lot of fun to discuss some of these topics. So you generally did cover a good amount of my background, but maybe to add a little bit to it, I guess started when I was young. I had a passion for athletics and different sports and participated in a variety of sports. And I think because of that, it drove some of my future career and education decisions. So came to BYU, got a bachelor's degree in exercise science. And then after that, I went to the University of Utah, where I did a master's degree in coaching performance. And it was about that time where I started some of my practical experience. So I started and coached a high school rugby team. Loved that experience. I did that for about 5 years, where it gave me an opportunity to take what I was learning in the classroom and applying it to a real life scenario, right? And then after I got that degree, I also, on top of my education, I got certified as a strength and conditioning specialist, and that was through the National Strength and Conditioning Association. And after that, I started working as a strength coach, and I worked with a wide range of athletes, so elementary, middle, high school athletes, all the way up to college and even professional athletes during that experience. Because after a number of years, I came back and I got a PhD from Brigham Young University, and then spent almost a little over 4 years at the University of Minnesota, where I did muscle-related research. And then that brings me to where I'm at now. As Matt said, I'm a professor here at Brigham Young University, and really my interest is trying to understand how skeletal muscle adapts to stress. And that could be disuse, it could be injury, age, or different diseases. And then I try to improve those conditions by using exercise, essentially. And yeah, hope with the end goal that hopefully we're improving life for individuals that suffer from some of those conditions.
Great, thanks, Jake. I hope our audience will notice if they're watching the video, we picked the scrawniest, skinniest guy we could find to come talk about muscle hypertrophy too. Jake, just a real quick question. Did you participate in any sports as a youth? What did you play growing up?
Yeah, so I grew up, probably most of all, I played soccer and baseball. So kind of bounced back between soccer and baseball, at least in my younger youth. And then as I got up towards high school, I did have some basketball, but I switched more to, I focused more on soccer, football, and then I picked up rugby as well. So, and probably when all is said and done, rugby became my favorite of all of those.
Awesome. Please, Alyssa, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so you've worked with a wide range of ages and grades. How would you define youth specifically?
Yeah, so I don't think there's a universal definition for youth per se, but I typically consider youth to be between the ages of 7 and 17. And obviously that is a unique range, right? You get a lot of different developmental phases throughout that age range. You get a different physical maturity and just a lot of different developmental characteristics that you work with through there. And so I'd probably say, at least when designing or performing resistance training exercises, it's important to account individually for all those scenarios, right? And cater any type of resistance program to meet the needs of the individual.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And do you have a specific definition for what resistance training is? Or, I mean, like you said, it's just needs to be applied to the age group. But generally, what is resistance training?
Yeah, and I think a lot of times when people hear resistance training, they may tend to get a little bit intimidated by the thought of maybe a gym or a training facility, right? You're surrounded by bulky or expensive equipment. You typically have mirrors surrounding, and I think a lot of times that may be what people envision as resistance training. And it's true, that is definitely one approach. But really resistance training is more available than just that definition, right? It's really any type of exercise that is applying some type of resistance to improve health. And so it's, and we'll probably discuss some of these forms later, right? But it can be body weight resistance. It could be doing functional movements. Anyways, there's a wide range that it can encompass and can be done at home. It can be done in all sorts of different environments as well.
Yeah, so actually, we had a listener or one of our audience, Evan in North Carolina, sent me a question. He wanted to know what is the difference between resistance training and lifting weights, which to me illustrated some of the confusion that often occurs with some of these terms. So Jake, what would you say, is resistance training the same thing as lifting weights, or are there differences?
Yeah, well, I guess I'd say lifting weights is a component of resistance training, right? So resistance training is much more broad and available than what is initially maybe thought of. Some of the mechanisms of resistance training that at least I often think of are body weight exercises. You may think of resistant bands, medicine balls, plyometrics, and different functional movements that can also fall into the category of resistance training.
Great, thanks. So you'd suggest that perhaps what everyone envisions as strength training, when you go to the gym, you throw a couple of weights on the end of a bar and you lift, that might be lifting weights, and that's just one mode of many in resistance training. Am I understanding that correctly?
Correct.
Great.
So then why should youth participate in resistance training? What are some of the benefits of it?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think a lot of times what comes coupled with resistance training and youth are these myths or misconceptions that resistance training is either dangerous or it's going to stunt growth, or a lot of times I know with girls, they think they'll become overly bulky. And so you get some of these myths that over the years have come about related to resistance training. And for the most part, through the current science and things, those myths have been debunked. That said, a lot of the myths and misconceptions do come from people that participate in resistance training inappropriately. So either by not using proper form or trying to lift weights that just aren't within their skill range, and as a result increase their potential for getting injured or having issues related to that. And so I think it's important to understand that really those things are very, very limited and typically occur from misuse. But some of the real benefits that come are typically that resistance training is going to make you stronger. It's going to make you more powerful. So a way to think about that is you'll be able to jump higher, run faster, move quicker. Other benefits with that is to increase your body composition. So you're going to reduce fat mass and increase muscle mass. And if you're an athlete and you combine those two things together, then the idea is that it's going to increase your sports performance, right? So you think if you play basketball, you participate in a resistance training program, and now you can jump higher. Well, that gives you a better chance at getting a rebound or blocking a shot. If you can run faster and you play soccer or football, you may have a better chance of outrunning someone to get to a ball. So really the idea there is that the benefits, if you're an athlete, can help improve your performance. But another misconception is that resistance training is just for athletes. And that's also not the case. Resistance training can be highly beneficial for just improving overall fitness and health. And so as a result, you can build lifelong health goals as well. And then another thing that I think is coming more into the field and maybe isn't talked about a whole lot is the psychological benefits. So it can improve self-esteem, it can improve body image, it can give you a mindset of resilience. And I think to go along with that, and what is more applicable to life in general, is that it can teach principles such as discipline, goal setting, perseverance, and just those skills that really apply to life in general, aside from just health or sports.
I love that. I think it has a lot to do with like the Strong Youth Project's mission, like how we want to help youth establish healthy life or active lifestyles. And so resistance training, like from what you said, has a huge part in that.
Jake, I really liked what you said about lifting, improving our capability of performing activities of daily living. Anymore, when my students ask me, why do you lift? It's no longer to chase a ball down, but it's, although I don't have any grandchildren yet, I think I want to be able to lift my grandchildren. I want to eventually be able to get out of a chair and walk up the stairs to say hello to my wife. So I really like that. And I love what you said about the mental health benefits that come from youth. I'm aware of the scientific literature that's shown that youth who lift are less likely to do drugs, less likely to drink alcohol. They have greater self-esteem. And I really love what you said about youth not needing to be athletes in order, to reap the benefits of resistance training. So I really like all of that. So in preparation for this conversation, I talked to a coaching friend named Alan from Oregon. I asked him what he would like me to ask you. And he said, please, please, please ask Jake to debunk the myth that resistance training is bad for kids. So is it safe to say, Jake, that resistance training is not bad for kids?
Absolutely. Resistance training is great for kids. Like I said, the pros far outweigh the cons, and the cons typically appear out of misuse or just proper use of equipment or just really not having supervision or guidance in understanding how to perform a proper movement or things related to resistance exercise.
Excellent. That's a perfect segue for my next question. I wondered if you, Jake, could speak specifically about some of your favorite resistance training modes for young people. What do you think is good for young people that may not apply as well to older folks? So what do you do when you are prescribing resistance training exercises to young people?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, I may resort back to this frequently. And that's to start off by saying that the mode of exercise should typically be tailored to the individual's age, their skill level, their developmental stage of life, and really that is going to dictate a lot of the approach you take. I'll give some examples, some of the things that I like to do. First off is probably functional type exercises, plyometrics. So you may think of these as exercises that mimic or enhance different movements or activities that are either done in daily life or in a specific sport that they participate in. Examples of this might be box jumps or pushing a sled or doing agility exercises with an agility ladder or things like that. And really the purpose of these is to build coordination, speed, agility, and those types of fundamental skills that will be, again, applicable both to life and to sports participation. From there, I'd probably move on to body weight exercises or even suspension bands, if you're familiar with like a TRX style band.
Tell us what TRX style band is, Jake.
So a TRX style band, it's basically a set of bands that you can attach to a location, and really it's just some bands. And so really what it offers is a lot of versatility for different movements and exercises that you can perform. And for the most part, it uses body weight, right? So maybe let me back up and talk about traditional body weight exercises. You may think of push-ups or pull-ups, maybe doing air squats, lunges, those types of exercises. And then the TRX bands, they're just basically an added, well, it requires equipment, but it's essentially an added component of body weight exercises that let you do rows. So in other words, you're pulling your body. You can use them for different curling activities. And the thing that really makes them nice is that you can change the intensity by the amount of body weight that you decide to use, right? So if I'm standing up straight, I have less resistance. If I choose to go in more of a declined position, then I'm going to increase my body weight and the resistance. So it really has a lot of flexibility and functionality for youth. Moving on, I really like medicine balls. So medicine balls are typically different weighted balls that you can use. They tend to focus a lot on core, on strengthening your core. So you can think of doing throws with the medicine balls. Resistance bands. So resistance bands are probably somewhat familiar to a lot of people, where they come in varying strengths that you can use to provide resistance. And then probably in my last categories that I would put on there are your machine weights and your free weights. And I typically reserve these types of exercises, again, for people that are age appropriate and have developed the skills and have received appropriate training on how to use these. So the benefit of machine weights is that they're, you can find these typically at any gym or training facility. And the advantage they have is that they can sometimes guide the motion. So you think of like a leg press or a chest press, that it actually helps facilitate the movement pattern. But nonetheless, I still think they require appropriate training on how to properly use them. And then that moves us on to the free weights as the last one. You can think of these as dumbbells, or exercises that they would include would be like a dumbbell curl or a bench press. And these are normally more complex and require additional training. So again, something to consider on appropriate for each individual.
Cool. So I really like the fact, Jake, that you talked for at least 5 minutes, maybe more, before you ever got to what I consider to be the traditional paradigm that everyone thinks of for weightlifting, which is the heavy metal plate that you put on the end of a bar. So you talked about plyometrics, including body weight, and you talked about bands. Can you define plyometrics before we go any farther? I imagine, so let me tell you what I envision as plyometrics. You tell me if I'm right or wrong here. When I think of plyometrics, I think of an exercise that often values speed, involving body weight. So I think of it like a box jump as a plyometric exercise, where you're jumping off of a heightened box. You're requiring fast muscular activation as you land, probably eccentric muscular activation as you land, and then quickly you're pushing off the ground into the jumping phase. Is that a plyometric exercise? How do you define plyometrics?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. You're exactly right. It's something where, again, you're using something like body weight to perform some type of an explosive movement, right? So the example you used was box jumps. You could think of like powerful skipping exercises or different exercises that again mimic some of the movement patterns that we perform just in our daily activities, but in an explosive way. So yeah.
Great. And I like the fact that the exercises you're recommending youth begin with are the least expensive exercises. You don't need a lot of fancy equipment. These are exercises that for all intents and purposes you can do in your basement, you can do in your bedroom, you can do in the front yard. I really like that. I wanted to highlight another idea that you mentioned that I really like. When you were talking about functional activities, you mentioned that you want to tailor the resistance training program to the sport that the person is participating in. I thought of a principle that I teach my own students about. We call it the principle of specificity. And Alyssa's smiling because she remembers this from class. But I teach my students that you want to emulate the following biomechanical characteristics. You want to emulate kinematics or the joint motion, and that would involve range of motion and speed of motion. I teach my students you want to emulate the muscular action type, so eccentric versus concentric, and then also you want to emulate the external load that you experience. So, if an athlete is a cross-country runner, for example, he or she is only going to be managing body weight, right? We hope. we hope that's all that happens. But a linebacker, conversely, is going to need to manage more than just his or her body weight, right? So I think
Correct,
that principle of specificity is super important. So it sounds like kids need to focus on actions that are specific to the sport that they're participating in, right?
Yeah, definitely. At least if you're looking to improve athletic performance, for sure. I think maybe something that I would add to that is that you want to make sure that they're performing exercises that they do find some enjoyment in, right? If it seems more like a military style setup, right, and take some of the joy out of the exercise, it may not be something that, like we talked about earlier, promotes kind of those lifelong goals of being active.
Yeah, cool. You got any practical tips, Jake, that you've learned along the way and as you've coached kids on how to make this stuff fun for them? Because I agree 100% with you. If this is not fun for kids, then they're not going to stick with it. It's the same for adults. If it's not fun for adults, they're not going to stick with it. They're less likely to stick with it, I should say. So any tips you've learned in your practice over the years? How do you make this stuff fun?
I guess maybe a quick example off the top of my head. I'm thinking back to when I was a rugby coach, and yes, you have to condition them to play a full game of rugby, but just performing sprints really didn't appeal to a lot of the players. But so typically what I'd do is I'd implement those into passing drills, right? And so if they're occupied on throwing a rugby ball back and forth as they run down a field, it takes some of that distaste from the exercise with it. That, at least off the top of my head, that's just a quick example I can think of, right? Where you take an activity and you make it more enjoyable. So
as I've coached young athletes over the years as well, I've learned that competition also makes things fun for a lot of kids. Some kids, I acknowledge some kids don't like it as much, but man, if you make things a contest for the kids, it can make it more fun for them as well. So
that is for sure.
Yeah, well, thanks so much. So I've got a question from a young athlete in Oregon named Ty. He was curious to know, he asks, is it better to lift heavy or should I focus on light loads and quick motion like plyometrics? And I think you've already answered that in some ways, but you want to just more clearly and explicitly answer that question for Ty? Is it better to lift heavy or focus on light loads and quick motions?
Yeah, so lifting heavy and frequent, it can definitely be appropriate and beneficial if that meets a few different things, right? First, does that meet your individual goals? Is that, are you looking to build heavy muscle mass? You know, is it something that's required for your sport? Other things to consider are, how do those types of intense exercise fall into your developmental phase of life? And probably first and foremost is to never compromise your form or your technique to lift more weight. All right, so that's probably my one of my number one principles is to never lose the form and technique. So if you're lifting heavy and frequent to a point where your form and technique is lost, you're increasing your risk for injury. So those would be some of the, at least my initial thoughts. But yes, along with that, maybe some other things to consider that I would throw out is, what does your rest and recovery look like? Muscle growth and adaptation takes place during the recovery phase. So I'd really emphasize that you are taking advantage of that recovery phase, making sure that you're maximizing muscle growth and really listening to your body and making sure that you're moving appropriately. Now, to add to that, you said, should he do it one or the other, right? Should I lift heavy and frequently or do plyometric type exercises? I would suggest both. I think having a healthy balance of both is really going to increase coordination. It's going to increase your power, your endurance, and make you well balanced and rounded from an overall health perspective and for whatever your specific sport of interest may be.
Great.
Can I add one more thing to that?
Absolutely.
It's another principle that's often talked about when discussing resistance training, and that's periodization. So periodization is essentially creating a planned variation of your training intensity, your overall volume, and the frequency for a specific period of time. And so one thing you may want to consider is breaking up, is performing or designing some type of periodization plan. And a good way to think about this is with say you play a specific sport and you have in season, you have post season, you have kind of the off season, you have preseason. So if you think of a specific sport and the way it rotates on how intensely you're engaged with that sport, it can take a similar approach with the resistance training, but potentially flipped, right? So that maybe some of that heavy, intense training that you're doing is during the off season, and where you're going to have a lighter load is in season, and then maybe post season you're going to have more of a rest type thing. So again, just balancing and mixing how you approach that process. A few benefits to periodization is that it helps prevent a plateau phase, or essentially where you seem to max out and you just can't seem to get past that hump. Periodization really tends to improve or reduce that potential for a plateau. It also helps manage fatigue, and it optimizes some of the long-term success that you'll have.
So what I'm hearing, to summarize the answer to Ty's question, it sounds like there's definitely room for both heavy lifting and then lighter, more quick, more speedy lifts. And it sounds like the time of the year should be considered when you decide what to do what. And then also it sounds like, and I think this is a great idea to reemphasize to our listeners, don't lift heavier than you can lift correctly. Is that what I heard? So if you're sacrificing form, then it's too heavy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Always make sure that you maintain your form and technique. If you look at the scientific literature and some of these myths and misconceptions that we generally talked about before that show where people think resistance training just isn't safe for young people, again, it's when they try to lift too much, right? They lose that form, they lose that technique, and that's where the injuries really start to come in. So yes.
So I'm hearing lifting too heavy can lead to injury. I suspect the same is true for lifting under fatigued conditions, and probably lifting too quickly as well, right? So trying to overdo it on the speed, the endurance, and or the strength can all lead to injury. Would you agree with that?
Definitely. Yes, I certainly would.
Yeah. All right, here's another question. I've got a specific question and a general question here for you, Jake. This is from a young athlete in Utah. He wanted to know about casein protein, especially post-workout for improving recovery. This is a kid I know well. He's trying to get shredded, and he's trying to become a better soccer player. So can you speak first to supplements in general for young people who are participating in resistance training, and then maybe if you do know something about casein protein, can you comment on that specifically?
Yeah. So let me first throw out the disclaimer that I am not a nutritionist. So definitely consulting with a nutritionist would probably offer more detailed advice than I can. But from a general standpoint, I guess what I'd say is maybe before getting into the details of casein and supplements in general, is just to understand nutrition very generally here, right? So what are proteins? So proteins are essentially the building blocks of our body, to put it simply, right? So if we're looking to build muscle, we need protein to help with that building phase. Some of the other macronutrients that are often discussed are your carbohydrates and your fats. And so generally speaking, our bodies are great at storing carbohydrates in our muscle. We're great at storing fats, but we're not so great at storing proteins. So what's often the case is with excess protein, it's discarded in our bodily waste. And so that said, the recommendations that I would give before looking at supplements, before looking at different proteins, is what is the overall quality of your diet? So are you meeting your overall nutritional needs with a well-balanced diet? Are you getting appropriate carbohydrates for energy? Are you replenishing your vitamins and minerals? Are you eating healthy fats? And then along with that, are you getting a sufficient amount of protein? And typically people are able to, and especially youth, are able to get those requirements in their standard food that they eat. And so that said, I'll go back to what I've stated a number of times. Some of it all depends on the individual, right? So if maybe you have some dietary restrictions, or maybe some things in your diet that are making you deficient in something, that's when you'd maybe want to consider supplementing with supplements or some type of protein specifically. And of course, consulting with a dietitian or someone to determine what those needs are. You could sit down with a nutritionist, determine what those needs are, see what your current diet is, and really understand if there's a deficiency there for you to then use supplements. But otherwise, my typical recommendation is that you're getting the amount of protein and nutrients in your body through a typical diet.
Great. Were you going to say something else?
Yeah, I was going to add specifically to the casein. So, and I'm not as familiar with the research specifically on casein, but a few things that I do know is that it's derived from milk. And I think one of the benefits that it has is that it's a slow releasing protein. So it releases the amino acids slowly into the bloodstream. So maybe a way you could think of it as being potentially beneficial is that after a resistance training program, I typically suggest that individuals consume protein relatively quickly after the training session, get the proteins in to again help build back anything that's been broken down during the exercise. And so maybe the potential benefit of casein is due to its slow release, it may help in that recovery more long-term compared to something else like whey has a quicker release. So that could be a potential benefit. Again, I think it's something that could be discussed individually with a nutritionist.
Thanks, Jake. I appreciate that. I think we've hit all the questions on my list. Alyssa, do you have any other questions? Any personal questions you want to ask Jake?
Not a personal question, more of a general question that I thought would be good to end on. But so we talked about a lot of great things, but I would kind of want to throw one on you, ask if you could like have one message that the youth just understand and they get through their brain, what would it be about resistance training?
I think it would be to be patient. Building muscle, doing those things, they don't happen overnight. And I think a lot of times that's what obviously that's what people want, right? We want to go do a workout, and then the next day we want to be able to see some type of result. Right. And really it's not the case, unfortunately. So I think that would be my overall message, is to be patient and to be consistent and to just keep going at it. And if you're patient and consistent and keep working hard, those results are going to come. You're going to see it in either your performance, or you're going to feel it just by feeling better and stronger as you go about your different activities in life.
Awesome.
That's good advice, Jake. It's good advice for Matt Seeley, and I assume that's good advice for Alyssa Higley as well. And all the other adults listening is be patient. I've learned that exercise programs, including resistance training programs, are like a lot of things in life. By small and simple things, great things come to pass. It takes a little bit each day over a lifetime to really amount to great accomplishments. And I suspect resistance training is the same.
Yep.
So can I try and summarize our conversation, Jake, in a minute or less, and you can tell me if I've missed any really key points?
Yeah, go for it.
What I've heard today is that resistance training, which can include various modes like body weight, functional movement, free weights, machine weights. Resistance training is good for kids and good for adults if done correctly. Some of the common mistakes often result from trying to lift too much, trying to lift too quickly, trying to lift under fatigue conditions. Those are the conditions that often lead to injury and perhaps give resistance training for kids an undeserved bad rap. Some of the benefits of resistance training for youth include obviously physical strength and speed, improved athletic performance, improved mental health, decreased anxiety and mental health disease or mental illness, improved self-esteem, I heard, is an important benefit from resistance training. I heard that resistance training is good for athletes and non-athletes, whatever that phrase means. I heard that it's good for everyone. I heard that you should start with less weight and more functional movements like body weight exercises like push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups, jumping jacks, and functional movements, including plyometrics. And then you can move on to the machine weights and the free weights. And I heard, this is the last thing I'll say, I think it's really important, but I heard appropriate supervision is really important for kids who participate in resistance training. And I told you I would end on that note, Jake, but I can't, I've had this question throughout the interview. Alyssa's smiling because I always talk longer than I promise I will, but what qualifies someone as qualified to supervise a resistance training program? Does a person have to be CSCS certified, or does a person just have to have a lifetime of experience? But what would you say to that question?
Yeah, I would say it's not a one person answer, right? Or a one background answer. So it certainly could include individuals that are certified in a certain specificity. So like a strength and conditioning coach, it could be a personal trainer, but it could also be someone that has has lived the experience, right? Someone that has gone through and learned through their lifetime how to appropriately perform different exercises. It could be a coach or someone that frequently works with younger individuals. So it really encompasses a large range of people. And maybe I'd take it back and say this as well, that if you're an adult or a parent and you're interested in, or your child is interested in participating in resistance training, I think a great thing to do is join them. All right. So either through learning, if you don't already know, work with some type of health professional to figure out how to appropriately do exercises. And I think where the benefit comes there is that not only are you showing by example, but it also helps build communication, right, with the children. You're now talking about how what you're doing. You're talking hopefully about the way your body's feeling, and you're more in tune with your child's progress and aware of any concerns that may arise. So
excellent. I love that last bit of wisdom, Jake. Go lift with your kids.
yeah.
It's good quality time. I have one of my favorite colleagues, Phil Alton. He passed away last year. He used to preach that a family that lifts together stays together. So that was kind of his philosophy of life, and I like that a lot.
That's great.
All right. Well, thank you, Jake, for sharing some of your expertise with us today. Thanks, Alyssa, for joining us. That's a wrap on the first video recording for the Strong Youth Project. I think we've done a decent job. I appreciate your support, and until next time, we'll talk to you later.